Learning Photoshop sounds like a great idea until you're neck deep in a pile of tools, settings, and panels that just feel impossible to memorize. Photoshop is not beginner friendly, or at least that's what people will tell you. But I'd like to respectfully disagree and prove to you that Photoshop can actually make a lot of sense if we follow the right structure. Because after helping hundreds of students in my programs, I've developed systems that reliably take you from beginner to confident as fast as possible. And in this video, I've distilled these systems into a fast, simple 4-phase process that you can follow for any project. So let's begin with phase 1. Now with every project we create, we have two different options. We can either create a new blank document or open an existing image. If we create a new blank document, we have total control over every setting on that document. So we could choose the exact dimensions, the resolution, and all those types of things. You'll want to create a new document when you have a very specific use case for your project. Let's say you're creating a video thumbnail or a banner for your website. You'll probably know the dimensions that you'll need, or you could at least go and look them up. And those are the things that you can input into the new document window. If you're just editing a photo, however, you would want to just open it into Photoshop, and that will create a new document with that image with all of the document settings matching the specs of that image. So from the Photoshop start screen, if we choose new file or we go to file new, this opens up the new document window. And for the sake of example, let's go ahead and create a new document to begin with. Here we can control all of our settings, such as the width and height of our canvas and the unit of measurement, which is currently pixels. We can choose our resolution, which you'll generally just default to 300 pixels per inch. The RGB color mode, you generally don't need to touch because that will just make sure your colors look the same on your screen as it does on someone else's screen. And then we can always just default to leaving this to 8-bit. As for the background color that we'll start with, I just generally set this to white, but if you have a different color that you wanted to start with, you could change that here. However, we can always update this once we get into Photoshop. As for these advanced options, you can just forget they're there. You don't need to worry about that, especially when you're just starting in Photoshop. Now, before we go ahead and click create, one thing to note is that you want to disable artboards most of the time. Artboards are useful if you're creating a multi-page layout where you want to create a slider of related images. It basically lets you create a series of different canvases all within one project. But since we don't want to get overwhelmed here, we just want to have one image, one canvas, and one area to work on, we're going to disable the artboards option. Now with all of this stuff set up here, I have a 5000 by 3000 pixel document at 300 ppi, which is my custom size of document. However, if you're not sure which settings to put in here, sometimes you can check between these tabs and you'll find some relevant options depending on what you're creating. So maybe you need to create something for your website, you need to create something for print, and so on. But in this case, I'm just going to stick with my example that I had previously, 5000 by 3000. I'll click create. This now enters us into the main Photoshop workspace, and your workspace might look a little bit different from mine. So it's really important to remember that your workspace is basically like a bunch of Lego pieces. You can add different pieces in, you can take them away, you can move them around, you can build whatever you want. So at the most basic level, you can adjust your workspace as a whole by going up to Window, Workspace, and then choosing the one that you want here. So say if I go to motion, for example, that's now going to completely change my workspace. It's going to change some of the panels that I have available, and it gives me a different layout for a different type of project. In this case, more animation type projects. But for most of us, let's just go to the Essentials default. This is the workspace that I think works for the majority of people. You can then go and customize things further by just hovering between lines of panels, for example, to resize them up or down or in and out like so. It's pretty straightforward in that sense. You can also undock any panels really easily just by clicking on that particular panel, clicking and dragging out, and now it is floating in space and it's separated from the area that it was previously docked in. If we want to go and place it back somewhere, all we need to do is click and drag on that, and you'll notice the little blue box to show us where it's going to be dropped in. I can go and place it like so and then move it within the tabs just by clicking and dragging. If for any reason, for example, you lost a panel, so for example, I press X on this layers panel, it's gone. Now I don't have a layers panel. What am I going to do? Well, if you ever lose a panel, just remember you can go up to Window and then look for the name of the panel that you're missing. In this case, I'm missing the layers panel. So I'm going to go down to layers. I'll click on that. My layers panel is back into view. Super easy. I'll click and drag this back into place and reposition it as it was at the beginning. So just remember that if your workspace doesn't look the same as one that you see in a tutorial, you can customize it using the window shortcut in the upper menu. Just look for the panel that you're missing, such as going to window layers, and then you can redock it as you would like. Now, when we're looking at this workspace as a whole, I understand if it can feel a little bit overwhelming, but ultimately there are just a few key areas that we need to remember, especially when we're first getting started in Photoshop. The first one is the layers panel. The layers panel is home to all of your adjustments and images that you place within your canvas. The canvas is this big white area in the middle of the screen. That is the working area for the entire project. The layers panel shows us everything that is contained within that canvas. So that's the first really important area that you'll see used throughout this lesson. The second really important area is the toolbar. The toolbar is over here on the left side of the screen, and here is where you can select all your different tools. And if you hover over them, you'll be able to see a little preview of their name if you're ever unsure. Some of these tools have this little arrow beside them, which means there's tools nested beneath them. So if we click and hold on a tool, it'll give a flyout menu where we can go and select a different tool nested within it. While any specific tool is selected, we can look up here at the top of the window, and this is called our options bar. If I go and click between different tools, notice how the option bar constantly changes. That's because the option bar allows us to control all of the settings within a selected tool. For example, if we had the brush tool selected, in the options bar, we can of course go and change the look of our brush. We could change the visibility of our brush with the opacity and things like that. When you want to customize how a tool is operating on your canvas, always go to the options bar. Now, the final important panel to be aware of is the properties panel, which is represented by this icon right here. If you don't see this, of course, we can go up to window and properties to reveal it, but this gives us a whole bunch of layer properties for our selected layer. So that way we can update different values on that layer. As you'll see later in the lesson, if we select something like a shape tool, you'll see shape tool properties within this panel. If you select a type layer, you'll see type properties in this panel instead, and so on. So whenever you want to customize the look of a layer, a really easy way to do that is within the properties panel while that layer is highlighted within the layers panel. Now at this point, we obviously only have one layer, and that is this background layer, which is created by default when we create a new document. But if we wanted to add an image into here, how would we go about doing that? Well, there's a few different options depending on your style and the project that you're looking to create. The first option to bring an image into Photoshop is just going to File and then Open and selecting that file on your computer. Selecting that file on my computer, I'll click on Open, and notice how it now creates a new tab inside of Photoshop. Now these two tabs represent two different projects. So that means that this image is totally separate from this project over here. If I wanted to bring this photo into the other project, what we would need to do is access our Move tool by pressing V, or we can find it here at the top of our toolbar. And then we want to make sure Show Transform Controls is enabled. And then we can just click and drag on this image, drag it up to the other tab, and then drag it down, hover our cursor over the canvas and let go. This will now place that image onto this new canvas as a new layer. And we can of course go and resize it just by zooming out and then using this box here, known as the Transform box, to edit the size and outer edges of this image. So just clicking and dragging on these points will resize our photo like so. Once you're happy with the positioning of something, you can move the entire thing just by clicking in the middle and moving it over. We can commit to our changes by pressing Enter, or we press the check mark to confirm our changes. You need to confirm your changes before you can make any other adjustments. But this method of importing might be a little bit too slow, especially if you have a lot of images to import. In that case, we have two other options to try instead. I'll just click on this layer and I'll delete it by clicking and dragging it down to the trash icon, or we can press Delete on our keyboard. The second option for importing our photos is just going up to File and down here to Place Embedded. This will still prompt us to select a photo on our computer, but when we press Place, this will add that image as a new layer directly within the project that we already have active. So rather than creating a separate project tab, it places that image right inside your project. The third option we have is to just drag drag and drop. And this is going to be most useful if you have multiple photos that you're bringing into a project at once. In that case, I'll just go to the file on my computer, navigating to that within my computer documents, and I could just click and drag that file over top of the canvas in Photoshop and let go. Now that places that same image as a new layer, so you can try all of these different methods for adding images as you'd like, depending on your style. Now, of course, I don't need 2 of these photos in place, so I'm just going to click on that topmost layer and delete it by pressing the backspace or delete key. Now you saw that while we have the move tool active, we can of course move our image around and of course resize it as well. But if you wanted to add some other distortions to it, such as tilting your image or warping it and things like that, that is where we need to use something a little bit different called free transform. While a layer is selected in the layers panel indicated by that highlight, we can just press Command or Control T, as in transform, to activate free transform. Now when we right click within our image, we have a whole bunch of different options such as distort, perspective, and so on. We can use these settings to flip our image, for example. We can also use it to distort our photo. So clicking on distort, we can click on this corner anchor point, for example, and now make our photo look as if it's sitting at an angle. If we don't like our changes, we can just press Command or Control Z to undo that. And then of course we can try something like perspective, and this will give us a more uniform option of distorting our photo to an angle, I suppose. But these are some extra settings that you can use to customize the size and positioning of your images within a project. In this case though, I don't want this crazy distortion. I just want my image to fill the canvas. So I'll press on cancel and then just grab my move tool by pressing V and then just resize this so it fits the outer edges of the canvas like this. Maybe bring it down just a touch like that and press done, the check mark, or enter to commit to your changes. So now we're up and running in Photoshop. We've created a document, we know how to import images, we're familiar with the basics of the workspace, and we can position and resize our photos as we need. So now we're ready to move on to phase 2. In phase 2, we're now applying some essential tools into our projects to correct the base image or set the layout for your design. All of the different tools can be hard to memorize though, so I created a beginner-friendly Photoshop reference guide that you can grab for free in the description below. It breaks down most of the key concepts to remember for the next time you're working on a project. That way you can hopefully spend a little more time creating and less time watching these tutorials. Again, it's free in the description below if you want to grab that. Now, phase 2 is all about building the structure of our project. So that's going to include removing any unwanted objects, cropping parts of our photo if needed, adding any shape and text elements and things like that. So let's run through some of these different adjustments together. To begin, let's say I wanted to extend this photo a little bit. Perhaps I wanted to make a banner for this image, and the current canvas size is just a little bit too small for me. So I could grab my crop tool by pressing C, or you can find it right here in the toolbar. And for example, let's say I want to extend the photo this way, I can click and drag out like so to create more of a banner look. But if I go over this way, in the area that I extended in, I have this gray and white checkerboard. And in Photoshop, this represents transparency. There's absolutely nothing there. If we just commit to our changes by default, this will just remain transparent. But I want to go and extend this image, let's say. In that case, we want to set our fill up here to Generative Expand, which will use AI to help extend our photo super easily. This of course won't work if you're going in the opposite direction and you're not creating that transparent area. But since I am creating that transparent area, I'll just press my check mark to confirm those changes. Photoshop will take a moment to load, and it will then just use AI to extend that image for me. Inside of the properties panel, as you heard about earlier, it has all of the important settings related to a selected layer. In this case, the AI created a new generative expand layer, and inside of the properties panel, I have some variations that I can click between to change the different looks of that extension. I like this one with the extra daisy, so I'll keep that in view. Closing up the properties panel now, let's say I want to remove some things from this image. This image doesn't really have too many distractions, but let's say I wanted to just clean up her dress a little bit. I want to just get rid of some of these creases and folds. So let's go ahead and do that using an amazing remove tool called the remove tool. So whenever we want to make a new adjustment to our photos in Photoshop, we don't want to do it directly on the layers. That's because when we make a change directly on that layer, it's not easy to customize or refine those updates that we're making. Instead, we want to try to create all of our adjustments on different layers, so that way we can easily add, move, or delete our adjustments as needed later in the project. project. So to create this removal adjustment on a separate layer from our image, I'll click on my topmost layer and then go and create a new layer represented by this icon here. And this will create a new transparent layer represented by that same gray and white checkerboard. I'll double click on the name of this layer and call it to removal. And then we'll select our remove tool, which you can find under the keyboard shortcut J, or you can find it here in the toolbar. I'll go to the remove tool. With that tool selected, up in the options bar where we can control all of our tool settings, I'll make sure sample all layers is enabled, and I'll disable remove after each brushstroke. As for the mode, I'll leave this set to auto, so it will use a mixture of sampling pixels that already exist in the photo and also using AI to regenerate new pixels that may look better in the areas that we're painting over. From there, while our removal layer is selected in the layers panel, telling Photoshop that this is the layer that we want to make our adjustments on, I could then go and just paint over this crease here. And I'm going to do this one at a time. So just this crease for now, and I'll press enter to remove that. Photoshop quickly makes that removal super easy for us. I'll scale down the brush using the bracket keys, and I'll just remove this other crease in here, maybe down this way, like so. Press enter. And boom, that's gone as well. If you don't like the result, then we can just go and paint over the areas we don't like, press enter, and continue that process until we are happy with the updates. I'll just go down this way again for this final crease and this bit of the flower down there, press enter, and now our work is pretty much done there. I don't really like this extra bit, so I'll just paint over it one more time to remove that next. Now turning this removal layer on and off by clicking the eyeball icon, we can see how easily we could update the image all non-destructively on a separate layer to fix up her dress and just make it look a bit more clean. Now for this project, it kind of reminds me of like a naturopath or something that could be on like a naturopath's website. So let's create a project that goes along those lines. I'm going to create a text box that will extend out from our subject, and then we'll add a heading and some body text to that as well. Let's begin by creating our shape. In Photoshop, we have a bunch of different shape tools, and they can all be accessed under the keyboard shortcut U, or you can find them right here. We can click and hold and you have all of your different shape tools. I'll just select the regular rectangle tool for now. And in the options bar, I'll just set this color to whatever for now, and we can update it in just a moment. Now I'll create the box for my text. So I'll just click and drag out to create this little box. And when I let go, the contents of this outline will become our shape. So let's say I want it to be about this big, and I will let go. When you create a shape, it also creates a new shape layer, and these shape layers have all of our fill, stroke, and roundness settings that we can always update later in our project. We can also change the roundness values of a shape just by clicking on these little blue circles, dragging inwards to increase the roundness, or the opposite way to, of course, make those edges more sharp. But since I want this color to blend more naturally within the photo, I could click on the fill color swatch right here in the contextual taskbar in this case. If you don't see this, go up to window and down to contextual taskbar to reveal it. But inside of this window, I'll click on fill. Then I want to choose a custom color, so I'll click here. And inside of the color picker window, we can choose any color we like, or we can just click in the photo to sample a color from our image. So I want like a nice light green color, something like this perhaps, and I'll click OK. Now that takes our sampled color and applies it to our shape layer. But let's say I want this shape to appear behind the subject. In that case, we can use things called selections and masks to make that happen. Selections allow us to select a set of pixels from our image to apply onto a layer mask, which will tell Photoshop which parts of our photo we want to have visible or invisible. This might sound confusing, but I promise you it will make sense in just a moment. For example, if I wanted to say make this shape appear behind the subject, I want to create a selection of the subject. So to do that, we need to click on the layer that our selection will be based from. So that's my beginner Photoshop layer in this case, which is the subject. Now within the contextual taskbar, I could just go and click on select subject. This now creates a set of marching ants, which is just this moving black and white line. With this black and white line created, that's our selection, we could click back on the layer that we want to place behind our subject and use a layer mask to selectively remove the contents of this selection from view on this rectangle layer. So to add a layer mask, we can just click on the layer mask icon while our selection is active and the layer that we want it to be applied to is selected in the layers panel. So clicking on that masking icon here, this now applies this mask onto that layer, and you can see the shape is only visible within the inner edge of the subject here. That's because on this layer mask, anything that is black is 100% invisible, and anything that is white is 100% visible. If we wanted to place this behind our subject, which of course we do, we want to invert these colors so that white becomes black. To do this, we can just click on that layer mask and press Command or Control I to invert it. And now we're telling Photoshop with a layer mask that anything that is black on this mask, which is our subject, we do not want our shape to be visible within. That way it gives us the appearance that our shape is behind our subject. The problem though is that if we were to move our shape by grabbing the move tool and moving this around, the mask also moves with the shape. If we want total flexibility and freedom of where we position this, regardless of the mask, then we need to use this one little trick. I'll press Command or Control Z to undo that, and we can click on this link icon between the mask and the image. That way we can click on the image or the shape or whatever layer you're trying to edit, and now move this separately from the mask because they're unlinked. So now when this layer thumbnail is highlighted in white, as you see here, I can grab the move tool and then just place this anywhere within my canvas, and the mask remains the same, so it always will stay behind my subject. This same concept applies for shapes, text, images, whatever you apply a mask to. If you unlink it, you can move that object without worrying about the mask at all. So it gives you tons of flexibility in your projects. But let's say I'm just going to place this over here like so, and I'm ready to add in some text. Creating text in Photoshop is pretty easy. It's like a Word document. So to access our type tool, we'll just press T on our keyboard, and then I'll just click somewhere on my canvas like so. This creates placeholder text in my version of Photoshop. You may not have this enabled, but that's okay. Regardless, just go ahead and type what you want on this layer. Going along the same naturopath route, I'm just going to call this whole body healing, and this will be my header. Now we can update the look of our text really easily just by clicking and dragging to highlight the text, just like a Word document. And then we can change the font of our text here in the contextual taskbar, or up in the options bar while our type tool is active. We can choose between tons of different fonts here. We can choose the style of the font, such as a thinner version, italic version, and so on. Not all fonts will have this, so just be aware of that. We can also update the size of our font. We can align it to the left, center, or right edge, and as well as change the color. But in this case, I'm happy enough with how this looks. I'll press the check mark to commit to those changes. I'll grab my move tool by pressing V. While the type layer I want to resize is selected, I can just click and drag on that transform box to resize this text, and click and drag from the middle to reposition the text within the canvas. So I'm going to just create this nice big heading somewhere like this. Pressing on done. Now with our heading in place, let's go and create some body text beneath. But what's important to remember in Photoshop is that when we create a new type layer, it's going to just continue out in a straight line for infinity. And if we're trying to create a refined box, that's not very useful for us. So instead, we need to create something called paragraph text, which will help to define a set box that our text can be visible within. To create this, we don't need to do anything fancy. We just need to access the type tool once again. But rather than just clicking, we're going to click and drag out on our canvas to create this little selection. But when we let go, this selection turns into a text box that we can always resize just by clicking and dragging on those little anchor points there, and it will update the positioning of our text like so. So that way it's super easy to create these text boxes without having to press enter and do all this manual formatting. In this case, I'm just going to go and paste in the text that I want to use in this project. With my text placed, let's say I want this to also be white. So I'll just highlight all of the text, then click on the color swatch in the contextual taskbar, choose white as the color, and now we're good to go. Maybe I also want this to be aligned differently, so I could choose the left align option or whatever you think works for your project. I'll then go and just tighten up this box so that it will help us with aligning things a bit better, as you'll see in just a moment, so that this box just goes to the bottom edge of our text. Of course, we can also go and update the width of it just by changing the size of our text box. I'll let it go out to the width of our heading in this example. Committing to my changes by pressing the check mark. This looks okay, but it's not totally centered between the top and bottom of the shape. So whenever you want to center an object in Photoshop, you need to first create a selection and then use the move tool to horizontally or vertically align your selected layer. To make this really easy, before we get into the nuances of this, let's just say we want to align our heading to the center of the entire canvas, not the shape. In that case, we would create a selection of the whole canvas. We can do that by pressing Command or Control A to select all. With that selection around the outer edge of the canvas and the desired layer selected in the Layers panel, I'll grab the Move tool by pressing V, and we'll first click on the 3 dots and make sure that the Align To setting is set to Selection. With that good to go, we can now click on the Align Horizontally and Align Vertically option, and it will automatically snap that specific selected layer in the Layers panel to the perfect centers of our active selection. So with this idea in mind, we could also create a selection of our shape and then align things that way. So I'll just undo this by pressing Command or Control Z a few times until we're back at our starting point. I'll deselect the selection of the canvas by pressing Command or Control D. And now let's create that selection of this shape, again to define the area that we want to center our text within. Since I want to center both pieces of text together, I'll click on one layer in the Layers panel and then hold Command or Control and click on the other layer that I want to adjust at the same time. If we go and align these layers as separate pieces, they'll both just overlap each other, which is not what we want. We want these to move and align as one unit in their current spacing. So when that is something that you want to do, you'll want to group your layers. With those layers highlighted, we can just click on the group icon or press Command or Control G to group those layers. And I'll just rename this to text. Both of those type layers are now within this group, but that means we can align this group as one unit. And that also means we're ready to create that selection of the shape. So I'll hold Command or Control and click on the shape layer thumbnail. Whenever you hold Command or Control and click on a layer thumbnail, it will create a selection of all the visible pixels on that layer. So it's super easy to select and align things based on that selection. With this selection active, we can now click on the group that we want to align. But if you were just aligning a single layer, you would just select that one layer. And now we can grab the Move tool and we can of course align vertically, for example. And I'm happy with the horizontal alignment, so I'm not going to touch that one. I'll press Command or Control D to deselect it. And now I'm happy with how this text is looking. Now at this point, we've used a series of selections and even some masks to basically cut out the edge of the shape so it appears like it's behind our subject. But these same concepts would also apply if you wanted to, say, remove the background from your subject. For example, if I only wanted to cut out this woman standing here and then place it in a different background, in that case, I would just do the same type of process, but then apply that layer mask directly on the image layer instead. So just as a quick example, I'll click and drag through these eyeball icons to disable all the other layers except for the image layer here. And then I'll click on Select Subject in the contextual taskbar to create an automatic selection of that subject. And now I can go and remove the background just by clicking on the layer mask icon. And of course, if I disable the underlying white background, we can see that this image is now cut out, and we can move this over to another project if we need it. This is like the most basic level of removing backgrounds, but we can go way in depth with it, especially if you have complex edges like hair and things. So if you want to learn more about that stuff in depth, I'll leave a resource in the description below that you can check out after this video. But anyways, let's just go back before that little tangent and continue on with phase number 3. So in our previous phase, we've set up the structure for our project. We extended out the background, we removed some unwanted things, and we added some additional elements as the core structure for the entire project. But now we're going to add some more creative effects to it. We'll add some adjustment layers to change colors or things like that. We can add some filter effects to add blurs. We can add shadows to things and stuff like that. That's what phase 3 is all about, because once your structure is done, we can go and add the nice touches to it essentially. So to begin, let's say I want to add a bit of color adjustment to this photo. A great tool for that is something called the hue saturation adjustment layer. But for any adjustment that you want to create in Photoshop, you can make them here within the adjustments panel. If you don't see this panel, of course, go to Window and Adjustments, or you can find all of these same settings by clicking on the adjustments icon at the bottom of the layers panel and choosing from this list here. But in this case, I'm just going to click on my topmost layer, and then I'm going to create a new hue saturation adjustment. Clicking on that will create a new adjustment layer directly above my last selected layer in the layers panel. Now inside of the properties panel, I can click on the color that I want to edit, let's say the greens, and I can go and update the hue of the greens. I can update the saturation and even the lightness, which will either add black or white to that color range. So let's say I want to make this just a little bit lighter, more saturated and make the green a little bit more washed out. So something like that. Turning this on and off, you can see how we've just added a bit more yellow to that. And this is essentially what an adjustment layer does. As you can see, there are tons of different options to choose from. We can't go through all of them in this lesson, otherwise it's going to take way too long, but you can go and just experiment with these different adjustments and see what they do in your photos. But one thing that is worth remembering is that when you create a new adjustment layer, it will affect all of the layers beneath that adjustment. To give you a really dramatic example of this, I'll create a curves adjustment layer and then go and just drag up the highlights and bring down the shadows to create a ton of contrast. This now affects everything within my layer stack, including the shape and text. But if I were to go and drag this curves adjustment layer below the layers I don't want it to affect, such as the text and shape, now you can see it's only affecting the background and the subject here, but it's not affecting the shape and the text because those two layers are above that adjustment in the layer stack. Now, additionally, if there's ever an adjustment that you only want to affect a single layer, such as a cutout subject, then in that case, you can use something called a clipping mask. A clipping mask will allow you to isolate one adjustment to one specific layer. For example, let's say I want to add this curves adjustment only to the generative expand area, which is this outer part on the left of the photo. In that case, I could just click and drag this curves adjustment or whatever adjustment you're using directly above the layer I want to edit, and then I can right click on the curves adjustment or whatever adjustment layer you're using and go down to create clipping mask. Now this adjustment has this arrow that shows us that it's only affecting this layer beneath. So turning this on and off, it's isolated to that one area of the photo. So this is really useful to remember when you want to customize your adjustments a bit further. Use a clipping mask whenever you want to isolate one adjustment to another layer without affecting everything in the layer stack. Otherwise, your adjustments will be applied globally to anything that sits below them in the layer stack. I don't want this curves adjustment layer. That was just an example. So I'll just click on it and press the delete key to remove it from my project. But with that adjustment made, let's say we want to add some effects onto our text, for example, perhaps a little drop shadow type thing. Well, I'll go into the text group and I'll click on the heading layer. I'll double click on this layer and this opens up something called layer styles. So whenever you double click on a layer, it will access layer styles and you have all of these settings to choose from. Let's say we want to add a drop shadow. So we'll not just click on the checkbox, but we'll actually click on the words drop shadow so that we are enabling that setting and then viewing all of the settings within it. Now we could go and say change this color. I'll go to white, for example. Click OK. We could change the angle of this, change the distance, and so on. So we could get some kind of interesting effects. There's tons of different ways that you can use this panel. I could probably create a super long video just about layer styles, but I'm going to leave it up to you to go and just experiment with these things and see what they do in your projects. But regardless of what effects you apply within the layer styles window, when we click OK, it will create a new effects option below that layer. And we can always re-access them just by double clicking on the words here to re-access all of those settings within the layer styles window. So if you want to add glows, drop shadows, anything like that, use layer styles. These can be applied to text, shapes, or any layer inside of Photoshop. Now with these layer styles understood, another way that we can customize our photos is using filters. There's tons of different filters that we can find under the filter menu. We have blurs, we have some pixelation options, and tons of other things that you can go and experiment with again for yourself. But something that's really important to remember is that when you apply a filter, it is applied directly onto your layer. So if you want to update it in any way, it's not going to be easy to do so. It's basically baked on and you can't make any changes. So when you apply a filter, you're going to want to use something called a smart object so that you can apply smart filters. You'll see why this matters in just a second. I know this kind of sounds confusing right now. Since I want to add this filter to everything on my background, I'll make sure to click on the background image layer, which is beginner Photoshop here, and then hold Command or Control, click on the generative expand and the removal layer. This is all the layers that make up my background and also the layers that I want my filter to be applied onto. With those layers selected, we can right click on them and go to convert to smart object. This will now merge all of those layers into one single layer with a smart object icon. These layers aren't permanently merged because we can always double click on the layer thumbnail to access the contents of that smart object. If you want to learn more about smart objects and how they work more in depth, you can check out my layers masterclass, which I'll leave in the description below for you to watch after this video as well. But in this case, we're just focused on filters. So with this layer selected, we'll go up to filter, and let's say I want to add a general blur. So I'll go to blur, and over here to Gaussian blur. We have a little window that we can choose our settings for our blur on, but let's just make it a soft blur like this and click OK. Because we have a smart object layer, again represented by this little icon here, it creates something called a smart filter, which shows us a layer mask, which is the same as the ones we used previously, as well as the filter that we applied. If we want to update this filter at any time, we can double click on the words of that filter to re-access those settings. If we didn't have a smart object, that filter would be permanently applied to the image and we would not be able to have the freedom to update those settings later. But this also gives us this layer mask, like I mentioned, which is super useful for manually painting in some filter effects. For example, let's say I want this blur to only appear along some of the edges here. Well, in that case, I want to start by making this blur fully invisible. Again, on a layer mask, white is fully visible, black is fully invisible. So I'll click on that mask and press Command or Control I to flip those colors to be the opposite of one another. Therefore, my white mask becomes black and invisible. Now we can selectively paint back this blur using a brush tool. I'll access the brush tool by pressing B. I'll just choose a soft round brush. My mode is set to normal, opacity and flow at 100%. I'll now want my foreground color here to be white, which is the color that we'll be painting with our brush tool. And we want to make sure our mask is selected, indicated by that white box here. Now when I just go and click and drag, it's going to apply that blur anywhere that I paint. If you don't want it to appear somewhere, we can just change our foreground color to black and then paint over any areas that we want to remove, because again, black is hiding the effect, white is adding the effect. These adjustments are made right here on the Smart Filters layer mask, so if I turn this on and off, you can see how it just adds that little blur in the bottom right corner of the photo. So this same concept would apply to any filter, and it gives you tons of flexibility in your projects and how your filters are creatively applied. Now, after you've applied your adjustment layers, you've done your filter adjustments, maybe you've added some layer styles, the final thing you could try to do is also use Generative Fill, which allows you to create new elements with AI inside of Photoshop. So the easiest way to do this is by accessing the lasso tool. The lasso tool can be found by pressing L on your keyboard, and it basically just lets you create a freehand selection just by clicking and dragging. Let's say, for example, I want to add some more daisies right in here. So I could just click and drag like so to define an area that I want the AI tool to create a new element. With this selection made, I can go and click on Generative Fill within the contextual taskbar. For the prompt, I'll just type in daisies, since it will match the other flowers in the field here, and then click on Generate. This will create a new AI layer, and within the Properties panel, we'll have all those same variations that we saw previously, similar to Generative Expand with the Crop tool. The only difference is that now we're creating something very specific within the area of our photo. In this case, we have a rogue hand that has appeared, and that's kind of hilarious, so I'm just going to not choose that one, but we can click between the different variations and find something that we like. If we don't like any of them, we can just click on Generate again, and it will recreate 3 new options for us to choose from. Sometimes you'll have to regenerate a bunch of different options until you find what you're looking for, but the same general concept applies. You just need to create your selection and then type in your prompt for what you want to add in. Now I'm pretty happy with how this one looks, so I'll stick with that. If you want to learn more about Generative Fill and all the different ways that you can use it in your projects, again, I'll leave a masterclass video below in the description for you to check out later as well. But now this completes our third phase of the project. We've again added our adjustment layers, we've used layer styles, we've added some filters if we wanted them, and we also used AI. You don't necessarily need to do all of these different areas at once, because some projects may only need one of those 4 things, for example. But regardless, once you've gone through these 3 phases, you're left with one major requirement left, which is to export your project. So that brings us into phase 4, which is all about exporting, of course. So to export our projects, we can just go up to File, and then down here to Save a Copy. Clicking on this will bring up a new window where we can choose where to save this file on our computer. I'll go and just rename this to example project for example, and then we want to set our format. Now, if you have not saved your project so that you could re-access it later with all of your layers and things, you'll want to first make sure that you save the format to Photoshop. Once that is saved, your Photoshop file will be the one that you can use to re-access and update any of these layers if you need to in the future. However, when you want to go and export something to share online, we'll go and set this to JPEG. If, however, you want to export something with transparency and the background of your canvas has that gray and white checkerboard in view, you could go and export to PNG instead, and that will export any cutout images with transparency, which is useful if you're trying to cut out, say, like a graphic for your website or something like that. But in this case, I just want this to JPEG, so I'll click on that and then click on Save. Sometimes a new window will appear with some quality settings. You can just leave it set to the largest options and then click OK. With your project exported as both a Photoshop file and as an image file like JPEG or PNG, you're now ready to close up your project and move on to the next one and begin sharing the images that you created inside of the program. Now, these 4 phases will help serve as your compass to every project, including to help you see which areas of Photoshop to learn about next. But to help waste even less time, remember to grab my free Photoshop Quick Start Guide to help you alongside your next project. You can grab your free copy in the description below. But let's quickly review these concepts that you'll need to remember from these 4 key phases. Phase 1 of every project is the project setup, and this sets the foundation of everything that you do. When creating something with a specific goal in mind, make sure to check the dimensions and specs you'll need for, say, a banner, video thumbnails, and so on. If you're just editing a photo, you can open that image directly and resize it later if you really need it. Phase 2 is where you apply your base adjustments, building the structure of your project. That includes things like cropping your images, removing distractions, adding graphic elements, or even cutting out different objects with masks. Phase 3 builds upon that structure with creative touches, using blending modes between different layers to get new effects, or adjustment layers and filters to customize the look of your type or images. Finally, in phase 4, the work is done and you're ready to export, which is quickly done by going to File, Save a Copy, and choosing the format that you're looking for. Just remember that if you want a transparent background when you're exporting, choose the PNG format, assuming that your project actually has a transparent background shown by that white and gray checkerboard. But if you've stuck around this long in the lesson, I want to thank you so much for spending your time with me. And since you're committed to learning Photoshop, make sure to hit that subscribe button so I can continue helping you on your creative journey. Anyways, I hope to see you again soon. And with that, I'll catch you next time.